Morning, everybody. Well, as I do my daily Bible readings, there are sometimes just phrases that pop out at me. I mean, as I'm just every day, just doing my Bible read, and there's sometimes just phrases that jump off the page and make me start thinking immediately and just get my mind working. And I want to share with you a phrase that I saw a few weeks ago. It just jumped out at me off of the page, and that phrase was, "We have no king but Caesar." We have no king but Caesar. And what I want to do this morning is just share with you what was going on when that phrase was mentioned, give you the whole context, give you the whole things that were happening there, and then give us probably a really good chiropractic adjustment this week, especially as we're going into an election week. So if you will, turn to John chapter 18, please. John chapter 18. John chapter 18. And just to let you know where we are and what's going on when this is going down, John chapter 18, Jesus has been arrested. He's already been tried by Annas. He's already been tried by Caiaphas, the high priest, and they're about to hand him over to Pontius Pilate. These trials, if you can even call them trials, they were sham trials. They had false witnesses, people lying against Jesus, and they already knew what the judgment was going to be before any kind of evidence was presented. Sham trials, and Jesus already knew it. If the Jews were going to put Jesus to death, it would have been by stoning, but we're going to see that they didn't have the authorization to do that. And so they're going to give Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and he's going to try him there. And before we actually start reading, I also think it's important for us to know some things about Pontius Pilate, for us to know about Pilate, because sometimes it can come across that Pilate's a pretty good dude. He's not. Spoiler alert. If we look through a lot of the historical record, I just want to give you a couple of examples of things that Pilate did in his interaction with the Jews that just show he was not someone who was fond of the Jews. His very first thing that he did when he became governor or prefect of Judea was bring in the Roman military banner, their insignia, their standard. And what's on that is Caesar as a god. And not only did he just bring that into the region of Judea, he brought it into Jerusalem, into the most holy places. And so the Jews were outraged, protested, all kinds of stuff got brought up about it, and they already were complaining to Tiberius Caesar about Pilate. And then a few years later, there was actually something that Pilate did where he took the money from the temple. He used temple funds to build an aqueduct so they could bring water to the area, which, hey, that's a good thing. But you don't use temple funds for that. To do that, the Jews would have been outraged, and they were. So they had protests, they had riots. And instead of Pilate listening to their complaints and, calmly addressing the situation, Pilate sent in soldiers disguised as regular people to slaughter those people. A few years later, a few years after Jesus, someone was claiming to be a Messiah and was really doing a very different approach than Jesus did and was riling people up, trying to get people to fight. And what Pilate does is he sends an army, brutally slaughters all of them. He was not a fan of the Jews. And because of this, the Jews were not a fan of him. And so there was actually sort of this direct line from for the Jews to Tiberius Caesar where they could complain about Pilate. And they had done that. They had complained about Pilate several times when we get to where we are in John chapter 18. That's going to be really important. I think that's going to shape the way that we view what this says. So in John chapter 18, let's start reading, please. Verse 28. John 18, look down at verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves, judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death," to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. So where it says it was early here, this could be anywhere from 3 a.m. to before 6 a.m. I mean, it was early. They take Jesus, the Jewish leaders, they take him to the praetorium, which would have been the Roman headquarters for Pilate. They take him to the praetorium, but notice in verse 28, they don't go in there. The Passover's coming up, and they don't want to become ceremonially unclean by going into the house of a Gentile. So think about this. The Jewish leaders are so worried about following the law and making sure that they're not ceremonially unclean before the Passover by going into a Gentile's house, while at the same time handing over Jesus to be killed. That's a little priorities, right? That's what they're doing. But they come there and Pilate says, what accusation do you bring against this man? And did you notice the response? It's kind of a snarky response. They say, if he weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him to you. They didn't even really answer the question that he asked them. What accusation do you bring against this man? And they say, well, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't bring him to you, Pilate. Why do you think they would respond like that? I think it's a pretty reasonable question when we're talking about trying somebody in a court. They had a history. They had a history of butting heads, and it almost seems like they expect Pilate, just go along with whatever we're going to do here. Just go along with it. Don't ask any questions. But he did, and they didn't like that. So Pilate, it seems like, quips back at them, verse 31. Okay, take him yourselves. Judge him according to your law. You've already said he's an evildoer. You've already pronounced the judgment. You don't need me. Go ahead and do what you do with your law. And Pilate knows good and well they don't have the legal right to execute Jesus. He knows good and well that's the case. And he makes them admit it. You see that at the end of verse 31? The Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. So it's almost like Pilate's like, okay, let's remember where your place is. You can't put anyone to death. So if you want me, come on, do this the way we're supposed to do it here. And what neither one of them knew, though, Pilate nor the Jewish elders, they didn't know that all of this tension between the Jews and Pilate was really to fulfill, verse 32, the words of Jesus, in what kind of death that he was going to die. Jesus had already said, the Son of Man will be lifted up, and talking about crucifixion. So they didn't know this, but this was all to fulfill what Jesus had already told them. So now Jesus is in the praetorium with Pilate, away from the Jewish officials. Remember, they wouldn't go in there because they didn't want to be defiled. So let's see what the interaction between Jesus and Pilate is. Let's keep reading here in verse 33. Verse 33. Therefore, Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Pilate answered, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore, Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. So in this interaction between Pilate and Jesus, Pilate just directly asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And it seems like Pilate got some information from the Jewish leaders because, how would he know to ask this question unless maybe he had heard something about Jesus before? So he asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Just point blank, this is a trial. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus, instead of doing what most people probably do when they're under arrest, which is speak when spoken to, answer direct questions with direct answers, Jesus just takes control of this entire conversation. And he says a question to him. Did you ask this of your own, or did other people tell you about me? I don't know if Pilate would have been ready to hear that. I just don't know. But showing his tension between the Jews and himself, did you see what Pilate's response was to that? He says, I'm not a Jew, am I? He says, it was your own nation. Your own chief priest delivered you over to me. So what have you done? Really assuming the guilt and not assuming innocence like we do in our nation, assuming the guilt. What have you done? You've done something. And this also would have been sort of shameful to tell Jesus, okay, I know you've done something. What have you done? I'm not a Jew. Your people handed you over. What have you done? Tell me what you've done. And Jesus, again, instead of answering this direct question with a direct answer, he goes back to the first question. And he answers the first question because Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. So Jesus is answering that first question, and he hasn't said that he did anything wrong. We know he didn't do anything wrong, but he doesn't say that he's done anything wrong. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. My servants aren't going to fight for me to have some kind of physical realm. It's not from here. My kingdom, it's different. It's not from here. And Pilate picks up on what Jesus is saying because he says, so you are a king in verse 37. So you can't have a kingdom if you're not a king, right? So you are a king, huh? And Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am king. Your version might say, you say that I'm king. For this I have been born. For this I've come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Jesus says, yeah, For this reason I was born. This is why I'm here. But my kingdom's different. He's already said that. I come to testify to the truth. And he says, everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. So this would have flown directly in what these Jewish officials had already done. The sham trial, the false accusations against him. It's almost like Jesus is telling Pilate, don't believe everything they're saying about me. Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. But then Pilate says to him, what is truth? And there's a bunch of different ways that this could have been taken. Some people believe that Pilate was legitimately asking Jesus, what is truth? But if that were the case, why would he walk away immediately after asking that? He says, what is truth? And then he goes out of the praetorium to the Jews and he says, I find no guilt in him. It seems like Pilate is saying, well, truth is subjective anyway. This isn't that important. I'm just going to dismiss what Jesus just said. And really, when you think about the position of Pilate and what he would have wanted to do with someone who was claiming to be king of the Jews is make sure they're not a political threat. Jesus just said, my kingdom's not of this world. My servants aren't going to fight some kind of physical battle to make me king or anything like that. So I think Pilate here is kind of like, check, don't need any more information, kind of a waste of my time. He goes out to the Jews and says, I find no guilt in him. What are we doing? What are we doing here? And so let's keep reading and see what happens next. Let's read verse 38 again. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. So Pilate comes out to the Jews here in chapter 18, verse 38. He tells them specifically, I find no guilt in this man. He finds no guilt in Jesus. But he says there's a custom to release a prisoner at the Passover. And so he asks, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? Why would he ask it that way? They had a history. He knew that this would get under their, this was sort of a jab from Pilate. You want me to release the king of the Jews for you? Just because he knew that would get under their skin. And that's exactly what Pilate does here. And just remember, that's the reason they brought Jesus to him. And that's the first question he asked. Are you the king of the Jews? He knew that this would get under their skin. So he's just poking the bear. And so they ask for Barabbas to be released here. Here in verse 40, it says that he was a robber. Over in Mark 15, it tells us that he was a rebel. He was an insurrectionist and an actual murderer. Barabbas was an actual murderer. And they were pleading for Barabbas to be released instead of Jesus. And so Pilate has, in chapter 19, Pilate has Jesus flogged or scourged, your version might say. And there were three different types of Roman floggings or beatings or scourgings. And it's hard to know exactly which one it is here. But regardless of which one it was, there was one that was the least brutal, and it was intended to be a warning. But even that one would have just been unbelievably painful. The whips had pieces of glass or bone or metal in it that was designed to go into your skin and rip it on the way out. Unbelievably painful, unbelievably brutal. So Pilate has him scourged. And even if this was the lightest type of scourging, it would have been unbelievably painful for any of us here. On top of that, this was a sign of shame. On top of the physical pain, this would have been just an unbelievably shameful event. And on top of the shame of being flogged or scourged, they make a crown of thorns and they push it into his head. And they put a purple robe on him and they're saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they slapped him. All of these things just designed to publicly humiliate him, to shame him. So not only to inflict physical pain, but break his spirits, make him shamed in front of everybody. And that's exactly what Pilate does. He says in verse 4, Behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may know I find no guilt in him. So Pilate admits, I find no guilt in this man. And so Jesus comes out with a crown of thorns, with a purple robe, in extreme physical pain from the scourging that he's already had. And Pilate says, Behold the man. And verse 6, instead of the chief priests, these Jewish officials, being satisfied. Here is the man that they hate, publicly shamed in front of everyone. He's been beaten. He's physically worn down. His spirit should be broken at this point. And instead of being satisfied, they say, crucify, crucify him. We want more, more. And Pilate says, take him yourselves. Crucify him yourselves. I find no guilt in him. So here it seems like Pilate's getting a little worried. Pilate might be getting a little afraid. We're going to see he's afraid later. So I think he's a little worried that he's losing control of the situation, because he says, take him yourselves and crucify him. Pilate knows good and well they can't do that. He knows they can't do that. But he's saying, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. But the Jews answered, verse 7, we have a law. By that law, he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Now, I think this part right here, where the Jews say he made himself out to be the Son of God, is new information for Pilate. He didn't know this before, because we're going to see a pretty big reaction from him. And let's keep reading here in verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. And so Pilate is even more afraid. So he was already afraid, because he was even more afraid here. After they say he made himself out to be the Son of God, he was even more afraid. And he rushes back to Jesus. And just remember, the Roman world, they were very religious. They believed in lowercase g gods. And they believed that gods could, affect men and maybe come in the form of man. And so Pilate runs in there and he asks Jesus, he says, where are you from? And Jesus said nothing. Sometimes silence is deafening. Sometimes silence speaks a whole lot more than words do. So imagine if you're Pilate and you're afraid at this point. Jesus is different than any prisoner you've probably interacted with. Now these people are saying he made himself out to be the Son of God. You go in there, you ask him, where are you from? Nothing. Doesn't say anything. That's powerful stuff. And so Pilate's saying, don't you know that I have the authority to release you? I have the authority to crucify you. Speak to me. And instead of being scared by this, this is a threat, really. Instead of being scared, Jesus says, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. I don't know. If I'm Pilate, I might be shaking at the knees. This is different. And he doesn't answer his question that he asks him, where are you from? But by saying this, Jesus sort of subtly implies, if this authority comes from above, where do you think I'm from? I don't know. If I'm Pilate, this is big. This is very powerful stuff. And Jesus says, for this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. So Jesus is putting more sin, more of the blame for this on the Jews, not on Pilate. He's saying, those who delivered me over to you have the greater sin. So what do you think Pilate's reaction to this would be? Well, let's keep reading and let's see what he does. Verse 11, please. Verse 12. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. So Pilate, as a result of this conversation he had with Jesus, what does it say in verse 12? He made efforts to release him. He tried to release him, but the Jews kept crying out again and again here, verse 12, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. And so Pilate goes to the judgment seat, makes him to Gabbatha, verse 13 is what it's called. And he says, behold your king. Why would he call him king there? I don't know. This is obviously Jesus is very different, but I also don't think that Pilate fully believed this. This probably is another jab at the Jews, because when the Jews say to him, everyone who opposes or everyone who makes himself out to be a king, opposes Caesar, and if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar, that's an implicit threat against Pilate too. Because remember, they had a history. They'd already complained about Pilate to Caesar. We know from history, Tiberius Caesar was a pretty paranoid guy. And so if Caesar heard that there was some guy in Jerusalem saying that he was a king and Pilate did nothing about it, who do you think is going to get in trouble for that? Pilate. So the Jews are implicitly saying here, if you don't do something about this man, well, we're going to complain to Caesar and it's going to be your neck on the line, buddy. And so he goes to the judgment seat. He says, shall I crucify your king? I mean, he knows that's got to be a jab at them, but he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place at this point. And it's the chief priests in verse 15 who answer, we have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. So he hands him over to them to be crucified. They said, we have no king but Caesar. This is a complete renunciation from Jesus, and it's also a jab at Pilate, I think, because they're saying Caesar's our king. Who's yours? Kind of a jab at them. Who are you going to prove that your king is? Pilate. And so Pilate finally hands Jesus over to be crucified. Last section that we're going to read this morning. Let's keep reading. Verse 17, please. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. So we see Jesus is crucified here with 2 men on either side, and on his cross was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And the chief priests, as they're getting what they want, Jesus is literally hanging on the cross, dying in front of them. They can't stand that the sign on the cross would dare say the King of the Jews. Don't say the King of, put that he said he was the King of the Jews. They're getting what they want, and they can't stand to see that title anywhere near him. And Pilate's not having it. He says, what I've written, I've written. Okay, that's all we're going to read this morning. What a passage for us to read. So powerful. I hope that it impacts you greatly. I really do. This is one of the foundations for who we are. From what we've read this morning, what I want to do is I want to point out a few things that I think are extremely relevant to us this week in an election week. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about Pilate here, and maybe we'll come back and do this another time. But right now, I want us to think specifically about the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders here. The Jews were God's covenant people. He had blessed them tremendously. He told them exactly what he wanted for them and from them. And on this account that we read today, I think there are some specific lessons that we need to learn as we go into an election week. So what I want to do is the first 2 points are going to be about these Jewish elders, these Jewish officials, these Jewish leaders. Then the last 2 points are going to be about Jesus in this passage. So let's start with the Jewish leaders. They chose politics over God. The Jewish leaders chose politics over God. The Jews said in verse 15, they had no king but Caesar. Who was it in verse 15? It was the chief priests, the people responsible for the spiritual well-being of the nation, the people who should have been leading the nation toward God and nothing else. They said, we have no king but Caesar. This was a blatantly untrue statement in reality, right? I think we can all say in reality, completely untrue. But by the way that they were living their lives, they were absolutely right. Their focus, their motivations, their intentions, everything that they did was focused on physical power, earthly authorities, and earthly power. This flies directly in the face of what God had told them over and over and over again. I am supposed to be king over you. And they weren't even trying to hide it. They said, we have no king but Caesar. They put politics over God, and they delivered the true king over to his death. And so for us today, I think we need to learn this lesson because we cannot choose politics over God. We who bear the name of Christ can do the same thing. There are a lot of people who call themselves Christians and those who even call themselves spiritual leaders who know more about their specific politician or their political party's platform than they know about Jesus the Christ. And that is shameful. And we should all be ashamed of that. If that's us, we are proving that we have no king but Caesar. If people know us more for our political views or what party that we belong to, then we are proving that we have no king but Caesar. We're showing our priorities are off and we have no king but Caesar. We cannot do that. Here's another thing about the Jewish officials, the elders, the leaders that I want to point out is that they were supporting things that God hates. They supported what God hates. Think about this: sham trials, false witnesses, plotting and scheming evil devices, releasing an actual murderer instead of allowing for justice on earth, and then shedding the blood of an innocent man. These are all things that God says that he hates in the scriptures. He hates these things. And these Jewish leaders who should have been leading the nation toward God in every single thing that they did were doing the very things that God hates. The very things that God hates. They had orchestrated it. They devised it in their minds. It's not like this was a spur of the moment mistake, made the wrong decision or just spur of the moment did something wrong. They plotted, they devised, they had evil scheming for who knows how long. They had intentionally plotted this out. These were supposed to be God's special people, and they were supporting what God hates. And so for us today, we cannot claim to be God's covenant people and support the things that God hates. We can't. And as the election's coming up this week, I'll just speak boldly about this. We cannot blindly support people or policies or parties who are promoting the things that God hates. We can't. What's hard about our election, I'm going to try and be fair. What's hard about our election is there's no perfect candidate. There's no perfect party. There are problems with individuals and platforms on both sides. It's definitely picking the lesser of two evils and which one protects God's values the most. But we who bear the name of Christ cannot blindly support politicians or parties or policies when they are doing things that God hates. Whether it's sexual immorality, homosexuality, shedding of innocent blood of the unborn, mutilation of the body for attempted sex changes, whatever it is, and whoever supports it, no matter what party they belong to, Christians cannot support those things. If God hates it, we cannot support it. Those are the two things about the Jewish leaders in this text. Now I want to point out two things about Jesus. First thing is that Jesus died for these people. Jesus had every reason to hate these people. He knew their hearts. He knew they were self-centered. He knew they were focused on earthly power and earthly authority and completely missed who he is. He had every right to hate them. But as Jesus is on the cross in Luke 23, verse 34, what did he say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know. This is the same Jesus that said, it's not the well who need a physician, it's those who are sick. And Jesus died for these very sick people who did this to him. And Jesus absolutely pronounces judgment on unbelieving Jews and ends the Jewish system. But who did he offer salvation to first? He offered it to the Jews first. And so for us today as God's people, and especially this week as we're thinking about politics and as we're voting, we should absolutely hate what God hates, and we can't stand when people call evil good and good evil. At the same time, we cannot hate the very people that God died for. We cannot hate the very people that Jesus shed his blood for. Jesus didn't hate those who killed him, but it's so easy. It's so easy I'm speaking for me. It's so easy to reach for hate when someone disagrees with us. Jesus died for them just as much as he died for us. They might not want to hear it. They might not want to accept Jesus, but we're still going to proclaim Jesus no matter what. No matter what. Jesus came to heal the sick, and we've all been sick. We've all been sick. We cannot hate the very people that Jesus came to die for. Now, the last thing I want to point out here is, I think I'm going to hold off on showing you what it is. The Jewish leaders and the people in our text this morning, they refuse to acknowledge Jesus as their king. Pilate says multiple times, mockingly and jabbing at the Jews, he called Jesus the King of the Jews multiple times. And they were adamant that Jesus was not their king. As they're getting what they want, Jesus is dying on the cross in front of them. They can't stand to see the title King of the Jews anywhere near him. They want the sign changed. They couldn't stand it. But even in all of that, Jesus is the king regardless. Jesus is the king regardless. Regardless of Rome being the superpower of the day, Jesus was the real king. Regardless of the shame and humiliation that they put him through, Jesus was the real king. Regardless of all the people there who mocked him, who rejected him, who were shouting out for him to die and shouting out that he wasn't the king of the Jews, Jesus was still the king regardless. And I think the same is true for us today. Brethren, I hope that this will encourage you, and I don't mean this in a mean way at all. No matter who wins the presidential election this week, Jesus is king. No matter if America lasts 100 more years or only 100 more seconds, Jesus is king. No matter how many people in our country mock or reject the idea that Jesus is God or that Jesus should rule their lives, Jesus is the king. I heard a quote last week, and I wish I could remember the guy's name. I'd love to give him the credit, but I'm going to share it with you. He said, "It matters a whole lot less who's in the Oval Office and in the White House because of who sits on the throne in heaven." Jesus is king. Okay, so everybody take a breath. I hope that this has been a fair chiropractic adjustment this morning. And I want to tell you that I'm going to vote this week. And personally, I think you should vote too. I don't want anybody to think that I'm coming out here saying that I don't support Christians being active in government, because I do. I'm going to vote this week. I have a candidate that I hope wins. However, when we go vote this week, I really think that we should never forget who's in control, who we belong to, and that as Christians, we need to support his interests while we're here on this earth. Jesus is the king. And if he's not king in your life, I want you to know Jesus is still the king. If you acknowledge him or not, Jesus is still the king over all. And so this morning, as we close, if you want to put Jesus in the proper place in your life as king, he's king regardless. But if you want to acknowledge him as king in your life, I just encourage you to make any corrections that you might need to make. Whatever your spiritual need is this morning, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.